This lecture, I'll talk about the server side. We finished talking about the client, so we'll talk about how a server looks. Sockets on the server. So we've been talking about, in the previous lectures, about writing code for a client, a generic client on your Raspberry Pi, let's say. So now let's look at the other side of that. Let's look at the steps that are required to make a generic server. And the server is also going to have to create a socket, but it has a bit of a different set of steps, different sequence of steps than what you see in a client. So we'll look at that right now. So first, a server, once you have a server process running on your machine, it needs to sit there and wait for requests to come in, right? That's the job of a server. It waits, it listens for requests, waits for requests. When a request comes in, it receives the request, processes the request, it gets the results, and then sends the results back. So server is a bit of a different thing than a client. So first thing a server is going to have to do is create a socket, right, that it's listening to, a local socket. Then it's got to bind the socket to an IP address and port. So when you create the socket at first, it's just floating there, not connected to anything. It needs to be associated with a particular port and an IP address of the remote thing that it's connecting to, which you may not know yet, but we'll talk about that. Then once it's bound that socket, it's got to listen to that socket. So listening means just sitting there and waiting for a message to come in. Now then once the message comes in, it's got to accept the connection, right? Once a request comes in, once say a client says, look, I want to connect. Once a client tries to connect, the server has to accept that connection in order to get some communication going, right? So it accepts the connection. Then it receives a request. So once the connection is made, the client sends some data and the server receives that data. So it receives the request. It processes the request and sends the response. So it sends data back along the same connection to the client. And yeah, that's it. So that's the outline of what should happen. So let's go through some of the steps, what the code would look like. And I have omitted the first part where you import socket. We assume we're doing that. So on the server, first thing you're going to do is you're going to create the socket, and then you're going to bind the socket. So the first line of code, mysocket equals socket.socket, it calls that function socket, which creates the socket. And actually, that first line of code is the same as what goes on the client to create the socket. But the next line is different. You have to bind the socket to an IP address and a port. Now, the port number I'm using here is 1234. I made that up. It's not a well-known port. It's just some generic port because this is just some generic service. But notice that if I were making like a web server or something like that, I would actually use port 80, for instance, because I know that's for web traffic and so on. In this case, I'm using an arbitrary port 1234 just because it's out of the way and it's not associated with anything. Now, the first argument to the bind is just empty quotes, right? The first argument is the host that you want to associate it with. The other host, the host that you're connecting to. But of course, we don't know what the host is yet, right? The server is sitting there waiting for a host to connect to it. It doesn't know what host it's going to connect to. So you pass as an argument just this nothing, these quotes. And what that allows it to do is like a wildcard. It allows it to receive from any host. So you just pass it nothing for the host, but you give it the port that you want to listen on, give it some port number that's out of the way, unless you actually are making like a well-known service, like a web service, something like that, and then you use the appropriate port. So you create the socket and then you bind it. Yeah, arbitrary, well known. Okay, now once it's bound, you're going to want to listen to the socket and then accept any connections that come in. So listen starts listening for a connect, right? Listen means it's waiting until some client calls connect, right? Trying to connect to the socket. So you call listen. Notice that listen, mysocket.listen, and listen takes an argument, a number. That number is called a backlog. That's a number of requests allowed to wait for service. So the way we're writing this code, the server can only, we're doing single-threaded code right now. Which means that we're only going to be able to handle one service request at a time, right? So the question is how many, say you're serving a request, how many other clients can be waiting in line for you to finish serving till they get served, right? And that's what the backlog is, and we're putting 5 arbitrarily. We could put any number we want. It basically tells you how long the waiting line is going to be for the clients. So then the next line we call accept. Now, accept, once you're listening to the port, it tries to accept it, and that's just accepting a connection request is accepting the call to connect from the client. Okay, so you want to accept it. So you call mysock.accept. Now this returns two things. So notice that it says con comma address. You can do this in Python. A function can return two things. And in this case, we're returning two things. The first thing is going to be bound to con. The second thing will be the address. So the first thing that returns is the connection, right? You need this connection to receive data and to send data. So the server is going to need to do that. So that's what the connection is for. The ADDR is the address that it's connected to. So that's the IP address and the port number. Now the port number we know because we bound to that port, but the IP address we wouldn't know until you call accept. And then the address is going to contain the IP address of the client that's connected to you and trying to talk to you. So, but now you have this connection, and this connection is what you're going to use to receive data on and to send a response back. Thank you.